Hello, my friends. This is Mrs. Surratt to talk to you about the growth of big business and technological innovations after the Reconstruction. There's that time period after the Civil War, Reconstruction, kind of before the next big era that kind of gets squeezed or forgotten, and that's Standard 11, where we think about how the country began to change. I mean, after that big, messy, nasty war, people just kind of wanted to move forward. And so we see a lot of changes in terms of business, in terms of technology, and we're going to talk about those today. So we want to start first by talking about the railroad, because really, truly, the country could never have grown without the invention of something to move us from point A to point B, which was the railroad. And you can see here on this map, Promontory Point, Utah, easy for me to say, which is halfway, and this is the point where the Eastern and Western railroads joined. So the Transcontinental Railroad was heavily supported by the U.S. government. I mean, it would not only affect other industries, it would allow people to move back and forth, it would bring the country together. It was a really useful idea. The government passed laws to authorize the building of the railroad. So they basically kind of gave them really choice land to help them find their path to get through the country. On July 1st, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act to secure a railroad line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. I don't think I've ever had such trouble saying railroad, but it's such a tongue twister today. So basically trying to get it from one end of the country to the other. So what they did was you have the Union Pacific Company starting at the Missouri River and working to the east, and you have the Central Pacific Company starting in California and working west, and I did those backwards, but the point is they're going to come to the middle. They used the labor of Chinese immigrants, especially the Central and Pacific Company, whereas Irish immigrants worked for the Union and Pacific Company. So now we're going to shorten our travel from one end of the country to the other, transport crops more quickly, be able to get from east to west. So this is going to increase the amount of food people can get to. Really useful invention. Now, railroads were good not only as their own industry, but for how they helped other industries. For example, now you start to see that the cattlemen, ranchers loved the railroad. They could ship their cattle for beef. The timber industry, they could ship lumber. You start to see the rise of personal and business mail order. You can buy clothing this way. You can mail order products. And you've got places like Chicago that start to become very prosperous because they're kind of a hub. So the product will come in, it'll be processed, it'll be sent out, and so this is going to grow those cities. And so you see also coal is needed to power steam engines and steel for the steel tracks. So you're going to see a rise in all of these industries thanks to the railroad. As I mentioned, the railroad was built largely with Chinese labor, especially when you're talking about Western railroads out in California. And the Chinese began coming in 1850 to try and escape their overpopulated country, but also to find gold. The rumors that gold was in the United States and the Americas abounded all over the world. They typically worked in the mines, but they also would work for the railroads. They were cheap laborers. They worked very hard. They were willing to take on more dangerous jobs than most immigrants. So from a railroad owner standpoint, they're ideal, perfect workers. But other people complain because they didn't try to learn English, they didn't try to assimilate, and they're undercutting the amount of money that they could possibly get because they're willing to work for less. So it was a very difficult situation, and it will lead in 1882 to the Chinese Exclusion Act and other limitations on immigrants from China. Now, during this time, we see a rise of big business, and the captains of industry, the economic titans, will begin to emerge. Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, was one of the very famous railroad barons. He controlled several of the biggest lines that ran in and out of New York City. So you've heard of the Vanderbilts. This is where they got their start. You've heard of Duke University. Well, James B. Duke was a tobacco titan. He founded the American Tobacco Company using machines to roll the cigarettes. So people could buy their cigarettes already rolled up, which was a great convenience. And then you have John Pierpont Morgan, also known as J.P. Morgan, and if you look around, I'll bet you'll find a financial firm named for him today. He was a titan in a different way. What he did was instead of building something or creating an industry, he would go around to these smaller companies and he would put together a deal where someone with more money could buy all these smaller companies. So he's merging them, helping to create monopolies. And of course, we've talked about vertical and horizontal integration. He's helping to bring these smaller companies in together, that horizontal integration, so that you can then have one bigger company instead of lots of small companies. So he was very big with banking. Now we have Mr. Andrew Carnegie, who is known for steel. He's the gentleman who made the finest and strongest steel in the world. And then he sold it at such a low price that nobody could match him. So he was able to drive his steelmakers out of business. He used horizontal integration to acquire competing businesses and merge them into one corporation, but he used vertical integration to buy the iron ore field, then the steel production, then the steamboat and train to transport his finished product. So he had a hand in every single level, whether it was digging that iron ore out of the ground, turning it into your steel production, turning it into your finished product, or transporting it wherever it needed to go. And he was the first person to create the idea of a monopoly. When he had the only steel company, he would raise his prices because people didn't have a choice. To Carnegie, a monopoly was seen as, you know, efficient. The idea that he didn't have to argue with anybody, he could set prices what he wanted, he could own whatever he wanted. Of course, to anybody else who was trying to buy his steel or keep up with him, a monopoly was not a very helpful thing to deal with. John D. Rockefeller was another robber baron, and he created Standard Oil Company in 1870, and by 1879 he produced 90% of the nation's oil. He bought the most important oil refineries in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York and merged them into one, made a monopoly. That's his horizontal integration, so buying up all of similar product and putting them together. But he controlled the production of the oil and the transportation of the oil. So that's his vertical integration. Every step he has a hand in. So he had the railroads and pipelines to move the oil. He owned companies that produced and sold the final products. My favorite, he owned forests and produced his own wooden barrels to carry the oil. So he had a hand literally in every stage of that production. He was able to set the supply and price of petroleum products around the country, and he influenced the world even. What he did was he had companies in various places around the United States, and it was very inefficient for him to keep traveling all over the place. So he created a trust, which would be a single director, a single set of directors that would manage all of his companies. And so he would manage them, and then those people would go out and talk to the different companies. Of course, there's some new inventions like the telephone and such that can help him with that as well. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people started to think this was kind of getting out of control. They thought that because of the monopolies and the trust, the prices were getting so high, and these companies were dodging the law. They were making up different rules for different people. So they're trying to figure out, how do we regulate these? And they came up with two ideas. One was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. So he said that Rockefeller's trust is outlawed. You can't have one single set controlling everything. You're going to have different directors for different companies. And they said that the Department of Justice would enforce what was a trust or not. But the thing is, they didn't clearly define what a trust was or what a conspiracy was. So if you don't do that, then in contract law, the person who didn't make the contract, it errs on their side. So John D. Rockefeller just said, oh, well, you didn't tell me what a trust was, and I didn't know that was a trust. And well, you can't yell at me if you don't tell me what's wrong. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act really didn't work. There was also the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. What was going on was railroads really liked working with the big companies, but the farmers, they weren't making much money off them. So they were charging little farmers and small businesses huge prices, where they were letting big businesses use their railroads for very minimal prices. And so the Interstate Commerce Act said, look, you got to be consistent. If it costs this guy $2, it's got to cost this guy $2. So come up with reasonable and just railroad rates. Except that, again, they didn't really define what does reasonable and just mean. So the railroads were able to use legal means to get around that. Oh, well, that seemed just to us. I mean, you know, look at this over here, and well, we thought that that was okay. So really, these two weren't very useful. They were nice tries, but they didn't really address the problem. And the thing is, imported goods continue to be so much more expensive than homemade goods, and the owners were using their wealth and power to get around following the regulations. So truthfully, it didn't really work to try and break the trusts and the monopolies. Well, during this time period, we also have a famous inventor, Thomas Edison. He was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. He just seemed to create anything that he set his mind to. He owns numerous patents, but I'll show you a few. He created the first long-lasting practical electric light bulb. Now you're sitting here saying, Miss Surratt, come on, you know better than to say he invented the light bulb. I'm not. What I'm saying is his light bulb was the first one that was long-lasting and practical. Most people, you use the light bulb and it broke within 5 seconds of using it. What's the point of having that light bulb? His lasted for many days. You also have the motion picture camera, and he was trying to capture what the eye could not see. Here he is adjusting his motion picture camera. And he created the phonograph. Here's his home phonograph. If you wanted one, you could buy one for your house. And this kind of helps to begin the creation of the mass consumer culture, the mass media culture that we're going to see become more and more prevalent as the years go on. So hopefully that helps you with Standard 11. Good luck on the end of course test, my friends.